the time is now, the people are concerned, there's an event, there's a venue, something has happened at the venue, and people just want to know exactly what are you doing to protect the people at the venue, or what are you doing to protect the people outside the venue.
Welcome to The Meeting Room. I'm James Lancaster. I'm joined in the studio today by two men who are into crisis communications, how to communicate a crisis or how to communicate in a crisis. I'm joined by Dominic Keogh and Chris Lewis from Crisis Communications Audits. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hi, James. Thanks for having us.
Just for those who don't know, can you perhaps briefly explain what crisis management is and what drew you into this line of work?
Well, I think one thing to bear in mind straight off the bat, James, is crisis management's a pretty broad church. There are obviously a lot of operational concerns for people who are in the crisis management space, and then there are communications concerns. So we very much focus on crisis communications, how to tell the story, how to make sure all your stakeholders know what's going on so you can minimize any sort of reputation to your brand. I have come from the client side, organizing events, and I met Chris about 20 years ago. He was on the agency side. And I spent a lot of time living and working in Japan. And of course, I was there during the Rugby World Cup when we had a massive weather event, a typhoon. And it struck me how very ill prepared we were to actually handle a situation like that. We had some of our delegates that were coming to Japan were stuck in Abu Dhabi, so couldn't get actually to Tokyo. And we had very little sort of resources in our bag to be able to communicate to people as to what was going on. So there was certainly a need there from my experience. And then when I started to speak to Chris about it, he was like, yes, this is very much a business need.
Chris, you're also in PR, aren't you?
Yeah, I've had more than 30 years experience in the PR industry. I learned about crisis communications in the food industry where there are plenty of crises and they all become quite serious at times, which was great training. Then I've been in the working with meetings and conference and exhibition companies for nearly 30 years now. One of the first ones I worked with was Wembley Arena, where I was involved with not only creating their crisis plan, but actually training all the staff and including all the media training for the senior people. And that, again, was a great learning curve. And since then, over the years, I've worked in my general PR role with quite a lot of clients over the years. Probably the most interesting thing that's come from this is that sparked part of this was Fishmongers Hall, which this is the incident with the famous narwhal and the stabbing at the Fishmongers Hall conference. Two clients came to me afterwards and said to me, I don't know how we'd have coped if that had been us. There's an 80-20 rule here, which is, I think, that 20% of the company, which is usually the big exhibition companies, the big venues, are prepared, but by volume, about 80% are not as prepared as they might be.
That's interesting. That leads me on to my next question, really, because I'm guessing most people don't go into an event thinking we are unready for a crisis. It's not something that's consciously front of mind. So what's the biggest misconception organisations have about being ready for a crisis?
Well, I think, James, there are probably two bits to it. One of which is that people just don't think it's going to happen to people like us. We're always very delighted when we open the newspaper and see that somebody else's name is in the headline and not ours. But in reality, a lot of people think, yeah, I think we have a plan somewhere. Yeah, we developed a plan a couple of years ago. Like, it must be somewhere in the office and somebody must have it on a hard drive somewhere. So if we need it, we're probably okay. Whereas, of course, in reality, that's often not the case. Or you've got a plan that's extremely outdated, wrong contact details, all of the above. And so, yes, people find themselves when they're in real difficulty not having access to the resources they need.
So it was a tick box exercise sort of 2 months ago or 6 years ago, and it's just gone into a drawer somewhere.
The other thing we find when we look at that and start talking to people is to be ready and prepared, you should have thought through the scenarios and actually have an outline template of the holding statement and the core press release statement that you could come up with, and that should be part of the plan. We worked with a client 3 years ago who, when they said came to us and said, we've got a plan, can you have a look at it? Could we think it's okay? We found out it was basically 5 pages, out-of-date contact details. All the staff had actually left. There was only one copy, so no one could have read it. And there were no scenarios in it.
How many scenarios can you realistically have?
Probably half a dozen to a dozen. Weather cancellations, accidents, deaths, fires, transport problems are the core ones that are most likely to happen within the events industry. But on top of that, you could nowadays add in a few things like conference speakers not turning up and saying the wrong thing. Misbehaving is one I've come across recently, whereas various people have been misbehaving at events and found their way into the media. Another one that's come up recently is celebrities having accidents at events as well. Some of those crises repeat themselves a few months later when there's a court case or somebody suing somebody.
Right, so there's a long tail to the story.
Tail.
People think of crisis as COVID. Insurgency in the Middle East is another big crisis. But there's a lot of crises that can certainly be planned for. We obviously hope that none of them are going to happen. If we've done our job well, our crisis manual sits in the bottom drawer and never sees the light of day. But people probably think about the big headline crises, but actually, as Chris says, there are far more common ones that have actually reasonable opportunities to reoccur, and therefore just be prepared for them.
When you walk into an organisation for the first time, what are the sort of red flags, the warning signs that tell you they're not as prepared as maybe they think they are?
Well, I think we often start with asking the question, do you have a plan? Because if there is a sort of slightly nodding dog version of that, that's hopefully a good start. And then the second question we ask is, well, when did you last test your plan? Did you do a fire drill? You test your fire extinguishers every year. Do you also test your crisis plan? And then there's normally a rather quieter response to that particular question. So they're normally the sort of two litmus tests that we start with. And invariably, one or other will show you pretty quickly whether somebody's prepared or not.
It's all very well having a plan, but the staff who have roles in the plan need to know their roles. There's been significant staff turnover. Many of them won't know their roles. So unless you test it, and you know that they know their roles, it's worthless.
I think a lot of people will think a crisis can just sort of come out of nowhere. And a lot of the time, that seems to be the case. They seem to be unforeseeable. In that scenario, what do you advise your clients? How do we deal with black swan events, the real kind of, wow, didn't see that coming at all? Is there a kind of preparedness that people can have?
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite the sort of 1980s where you had those sort of free-form letters with blanks at various stages throughout it, but it's not far off it. So what we find is if you develop a couple of sort of core templates for likely events, so you might be a weather event, it might be a fire event that Chris talked about, that at least you have the core, and then you're probably 80% of the way there. And of course, there's always going to have to be some adjustment at the last minute. But if you feel as though I've got a release ready to go, I've got a formal statement ready to go, I've had it approved by the lawyers, I've had it approved by the board of management or whatever governance structure you have, you're kind of most of the way there. So our whole sort of concept for crisis communications audits is to enable people to be able to respond in a crisis themselves without calling us at all, actually. So we really want people to feel as though actually we can handle any crisis. We don't need to worry about those events because we are ready to handle them when they come our way.
Do people tend to over-communicate a crisis or under-communicate a crisis?
In the first instance, they can rush into a statement. And the danger is that they start repeating rumour and speculation. Start with the facts and stick only to the facts and don't say anything you got them. But the most important first thing to do is acquire the facts. With all communications, you can only communicate when you have something new to say, whether the story's moved on. You take an event like the Middle East. First of all, yes, this is cancelled. These conferences are being cancelled. This is what the situation is. The next question is, that will be a holding statement. They want to know then, is it being rescheduled? Will they get their money back? In the first instance, you don't know that unless you have pre-decided that. So you have to communicate when you have something new to say, which you believe is answering their questions. Unless there's a big gap between it, there's no point in actually just saying, we'll be with you soon. That should be dealt with if there are incoming requests for information by, say, a sales team or a management team. But being proactive generally, you just have to say something when you've got something new to say. Also,
there's this issue of external and internal communications, going out to the press, for example. Presumably that requires a different way of looking at it than internal communication.
Well, I think you have to think about channels in its entirety, that now there are so many ways for information to get out into be it the consumer, be it an interested party, be it a related party. So it's about recognizing that there are multiple channels to get your message out, and not all of them can digest something the format of a long press release, for example. So you've got to think about where you're going to get your story out so that everybody who needs to know about what's going on knows. So we see, nowadays you often see in the media sort of random people quoted about incidents because the person who has the issue is basically either doing no comment or not saying anything at all and just disappearing. We had recently a client who found that the local publican was asked for an interview on the basis that in this particular case the client wasn't saying anything. So then all of a sudden you lose complete control over the story. So what I always say to people is think about the multitude of channels to get your message out, and then to communicate quickly and efficiently, because obviously we were used to the golden hour in the concept of a crisis, but now it's golden minutes, I'm afraid.
Your job has presumably changed a hell of a lot over the last decade or two. You can quickly lose control of a story now.
Absolutely. The most important thing is everybody who's at an incident is now an instant reporter with their mobile phone. And I've seen instances like of that recently. For instance, I was on a Ryanair flight where there was a fight breaking out and the police coming on and all sorts of people like that. And the pilot was saying, please do not photograph this and share this on social media. It's instant reporting. The other thing that's added a new dimension from the new technology is cyber hacking and security, which is a new threat in itself, and B, has totally changed the fact that so many people have all their communications plans and databases and templates on somewhere that may have been hacked, or in certain instances like fire and the like, they may not have access to. So one of our simple tips is very old-fashioned, which is make sure you have a hard printed copy of the manual to hand that you and at least more than one copy that can be accessed, because cybersecurity is, as I say, not only a threat in itself, but a major hindrance.
We work a lot with schools, and we always say, no, print one and give one to every member of the management team so they keep it with the recipe books in the kitchen. Yeah. Because in reality, a lot of incidents that take place in schools take place out of hours. And so with events, a lot of events organizers are preparing things over a weekend, or there's a weekend coming before the big event. Then all of a sudden we have planes being diverted, we have an incoming weather warning, and everybody goes, I can't get to the office. I can't get to actually the information that I need to start communicating. And because speed, as I said, that golden hour is shrunk into minutes now, it's even more imperative that people are able to act quickly and that there is really no time for delay or jumping in your car for that matter.
Can you give me an example of an event where there has been a crisis where you think the communication has been either exceptionally good, or might be a bit more fun to say exceptionally bad?
Well, yes. But, within the crisis industry, there is one, which is actually travel related as well. There's one legendary case, which is British Midlands and the air crash on the A1, the M1 near Keogh, and the way Sir Michael Bishop, the then chairman, controlled the whole thing. He not only turned up in person and spoke personally to many people involved, but his whole approach that he radiated throughout that gave the sense of caring. And one of the things that we explain to people when we're teaching people to write their own statements is you have to show that note of care. And you see it in lots nowadays about sympathy for the people involved, to show that that the care of the people who suffered from whatever this instance is top priority. He was probably one of the first people who set the tone for doing that.
And probably the corollary of that in terms of airlines is probably thinking about rather recently the chief executive of Heathrow Airport, who sadly had nipped off to bed during the time that the airport was closed, and that caused a huge amount of kerfuffle and obviously a real negative backlash from a public relations and brand perspective.
The man at the top or the woman at the top in some cases has to show real compassion, real care. Presumably that means they should have had some media training to go out in front of the camera.
Oftentimes the CEO might be dealing with an operational issue, so you do need to have a backup, ideally one or two other people that can also speak to the media if required. So it's not just about every task falling on one shoulder, but rather having a plethora of people who can pick up a different part of the role and be responsible for communications.
When a crisis hits during a live event, the BAFTAs incident with the guy with Tourette's and the N-word, if you're BAFTA at that point in time, are there sort of three golden rules that people should sort of click into immediately when something like that happens.
The one question that remains still a little bit unanswered there is actually who had the facts of the information. So there were clearly people in the studio making some sort of instant decisions. There's a producer, there's directors, then there's the people on the ground in the auditorium, there's the people on the stage. There's a lot of people who are potentially trying to make a decision as best they can. It struck me at that particular case that there wasn't a clear leader, that in fact, just like football, people did not know the positions they're supposed to play in. And so that seemed to ring over. And so that's why we got this sort of rather trickle on for even several days later. It was all a bit sort of confused as, well, who made a decision? And that certainly seemed to be an issue. So we always say to people, when you have your crisis team, make sure that everybody knows who's responsible. Then you've got to think there's a lot of audiences here that we need to actually communicate with. So there's the individual themselves and their family and their associated sort of colleagues, if you like. There's the people in the audience, there's the BBC, there's the government. So there are lots of stakeholders involved here. So actually, who's responsible for communicating with each one? So we spend a lot of time working with organizations to help them identify who are their audiences. We always think about, it's the people in the room in front of me, but actually, no, this is a TV show. It's broadcast everywhere. So same with a conference and event. You've got the people that are in the room, but what about all the people outside the room? And who are the people that we need to communicate with, that they have the correct information, they have the facts? So we always start there at the very beginning with people to make sure that they have that to hand.
The key thing is also customizing it to the stakeholders. Think of each of those audiences and thinking you can't do the one-size-fits-all communications. And so you need to work out who those different audiences and what nuances should be prepared in those. And the key thing is this, we mentioned before, cutting out rumour with these. The fact is most important, and avoiding speculation, and make sure those facts are accurate. One I think is an interesting lesson that's been around recently in crisis communications is the ones around many of these national incidents that have involved asylum seekers, where the police have learned the most important thing nowadays is to cut off the speculation as to whether this person was an asylum seeker and what nationality they are, so that where possible that can help stop riots, put simply.
Just going back to the BAFTA thing, what struck me was that you have an organisation like BAFTA, you have an organisation like the BBC, and you had a scenario that developed that, to my mind, was foreseeable. And what struck me was not that it happened, it was that, like you said, in the aftermath, there was this confusion about who was responsible. The guys in the studio van outside said they couldn't hear the N-word. Now, to my mind, that's a perfectly plausible excuse. But the BBC seemed reluctant to say it because it kind of looked bad, or they might have thought it reflected badly on them. To me, it showed the scale of the problem in terms of crisis communications.
Well, in that example that Chris gave of Michael Bishop, he jumped straight in his car. Back in the days, there weren't mobile phones, there were car phones, and he actually started doing interviews directly from his car, talking to the media, saying, look, I'm the chief executive and I care about these people. Then he arrived on site, he immediately dealt with the emergency services that were in attendance, and then he got straight out and contacted the families and went to meet them personally. So he really got down into it without worrying about the gloss of PR and should we get our story straight? And I think all too often today, people get so lost in, we have to be very careful about what we say. But actually, people just want a pretty authentic response, which is actually, no, the production team in the van couldn't actually hear that, and so therefore they missed it. It was just a very basic error that unfortunately took place, but there's no need to sort of hide behind a whole load of things. I think it just doesn't really help the situation. It just inflames it.
In a lot of walks of life, politics, especially the media, is now a sense of just authenticity, and people respond to it.
And that's why in the context of writing announcements or telling people what's happening is to actually stick to the facts. Try not and embellish it. Try not and sort of gloss it up and make it into a spin positive story. That's not the time for it. The time is now. The people are concerned. There's an event, there's a venue, something has happened at the venue, and people just want to know exactly what are you doing to protect the people at the venue, or what are you doing to protect the people outside the venue. So don't get into using it as an opportunity to start sell your services. This is not the point. The point is, as you said, be authentic and just tell people what's going on. And people really respond much better to that approach.
Now, when a crisis is unfolding live, or people say in real time these days, I've never known what that means, but as when a crisis is unfolding, two things are happening. There's a kind of operational need to solve the problem, and there's a communications response that's needed as well. I often hear people say, well, we needed to sort out what was going on the ground. We couldn't communicate, blah, blah, blah. Is that just a numbers game, or is it?
It's a structural fault, to be honest. Our advice is, we were talking right at the beginning about how there are two sides to this, the operations and the crisis. Our view is there should be a clear team who are the crisis comms team, who are working closely alongside the people who are dealing with them, because they will have to be, to get established, to know the facts. And if there are changing facts, if it's a moving instance, somebody injured, are they getting better or worse, or more people injured, etc. But they need to be kept separate within that environment, and keep the balance up to date, in time and structure, so they are well informed of the progressing story. And one particular fault that I see often when we see in plans is when we look at the plans within, say, an organisation, and this whole business, back to matter of leadership, we'll see that particularly in smaller organisations, the CEO is leading the crisis, leading business as usual, and the chief spokesperson. They can't do it. It doesn't work. As Dominic said, you need more people who are potentially media spokesmen, and for the CEO to not try and do all things, but delegate and keep those separate teams running in parallel, but not try to do all of it.
And we've had the opposite of that, where people say, oh, well, we just like to have a meeting. So we all get together, CEO and head of comms and head of events, and we'll sit around and come up with a decision through consensus. It's like, you just don't have the time to do that. Everybody, just like the football analogy, you know your position. Once somebody says, we are now in a crisis, everybody knows what to do. And years ago, I remember listening to Clive Woodward saying that, when a rugby player gets the ball into their hands, it's too late to decide what to do with it at that point. They have to have decided before the ball comes in. And really, from a crisis comms point of view, it's exactly the same. The right people know, I'm responsible for communicating just with this audience. That's my job in a crisis comms scenario. And similarly, the folks on the operational side know, I don't have to worry about communications, but I just need to make sure that the comms team know the facts of what's going on. So it's just about people playing in the right position.
Sometimes the whole team are not available, and particularly that might actually happen in some places. And I've had experience of this when I worked with Wembley, where quite often the CEO was on a Saturday night nowhere near the place. Rather than this consensus, you have to have a designated deputy in every role who knows not only their own role, but the role that they're deputising to, so that they can carry it out.
What happens in that scenario where crisis is happening? You're the head of crisis comms. You've been given this task of communicating effectively to internal stakeholders and maybe the outside world what's happening. What happens when the CEO sort of decides, no, I'm in charge here, I make the decisions? That's got to be difficult, and that's got to happen quite a lot, doesn't it?
What we'd rather do is get out of the heat situation of a particular scenario and actually develop a plan off camera, if you like, so that beforehand, actually the CEO has already agreed who's going to take the lead. Now, it may well be that they are actually going to be the people that are going to face up to camera, which is fine, but then they've appointed an operational lead. So that really, when it gets into the heat of the moment, it's too late to start having a bit of a granny's meeting to decide, oh, well, actually, are you taking charge or am I taking charge here? That's already been dealt with beforehand. So really what we try and do with crisis communications audits is to see where is an institution, where is an organization today, and then get them set up so they have all of those decisions made, so that in the unlikely event a crisis happens, everybody is perfectly calm because everybody knows what each other's role is and what to do.
I'm pleased to say most of the places we've worked with, there's been a CEO who's recognised that they are standing above this, that they are managing a team, and in many cases they will do what the head of the crisis operations or the head of the crisis comms team asks them to do, delegates to them, and they just oversee just to make sure that all those other teams are doing their roles.
There might be people watching who are thinking, well, who do we actually get to do this job? Is it comms? Is it our PR company? You're from the world of PR, Chris. If someone has a PR company, presumably they can't just rely on their PR company to do this unless it's specified that the PR company will do crisis comms. It's more specialist, is it?
Yes, it requires a lot of experience. There's a lot of common sense, but there's also, I hope you learn, people are going to understand from this conversation, there's a lot of things that you learn from experience, or you learn from being specialist, or being miserable like me and spend all their time reading disaster stories about what's gone right and wrong and learning from them. It's something that you do. The plan should be done by a specialist who knows what they're doing. In the incidents there, hopefully the comms team are trained. They may well be, there are specialist comms team, crisis comms teams like us. They can well be part of a PR team. Most organisations have a PR team who've got a background which is, let's say, promotional a lot of the time. There's a different mindset. I have the devil's advocate, Mr. Pessimist mindset, which I've had over these years of doing this, which is a different mindset to many of my colleagues in PR who are just looking for the best opportunity to promote a brand.
And I think also it's fair to say that actually developing a comms plan is a bit like an insurance policy, James. You have it there and you hope you're never going to use it. Unfortunately, and I wouldn't include us in this, that certain PR companies will take great advantage of ambulance chasing when there is a crisis. I mean, we only saw this very big story last year for the Rugby Football Union paying potentially as much as £5,000 a day to get advice from a crisis management consultant. So this thing can rack up to a pretty big number. So actually spending a little bit of money now, getting your house in order, knowing how you're going to handle a crisis will really save you an awful lot in the middle and longer term.
If a venue, conference or festival organiser listening to this podcast could do only one thing next week to improve their crisis preparedness, what would you suggest?
Well, I'd probably say start with a fire drill, because then you really will flush out whether you've got a workable plan or not. And clearly, well, I think probably it's fair to say, Chris, if they haven't done that, then just create a plan. It doesn't have to be War and Peace. And a lot of people tell us, oh, it's been on my list to do. We've talked about it in management meetings. We kept saying we must do this, but we just haven't done it. And, every day that you open the paper, you're one step closer to your name being in the paper. And I think for a little bit of effort, and it really doesn't take that long, you can just pre-handle any major situation that's coming your way and hopefully be in a lot better position to be able to handle a crisis when you need to.
Think of all those scenarios that might be disasters for your coming event and make sure that you've got press holding statements that act as templates for the majority of them, and core communications with your audience. So if it's an event, what you communicate with your exhibitors, your delegates and the like, all pre-thought as a template for that event, because under pressure, you're not going to have time to start writing from scratch. That's time wasted.
Chris, Dominic, thanks for joining me in the meeting room.
Thanks very much, James.